And so for me, man, it was just commendable and inspirational to hear him talk about these things. And he still has a smile on his face. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, yeah, obviously it's painful, but he made it through. You know what I mean? So it's that was really, really, refreshing.
Yeah, and so since a lot of what we focus on here is mental health, the main aspect, or
Mhm.
let me not say the main aspect, one of the main aspects that sort of attracted me to the book was when you and I kind of in kind of our personal dialogue
Right,
talked about what it
right.
was, what it means to have what's called post traumatic growth. And so just before we kind of delve into that topic, I really want to define it for our audience. So
Sure.
last week we had Scott Barry Kaufman on, and so Scott has this really great definition in his book. So I want to read it to you, Solomon, and kind of get your take on it, and
Cool,
obviously put it in
cool,
context too with
cool,
Muta's life.
cool,
Okay, so
cool, cool.
so this is in Scott's chapter on exploration. So he wrote,
Yep.
in fact, many who experience trauma, such as being diagnosed with a chronic or terminal illness, losing a loved one,
Mhm.
or experiencing sexual assault, not only show incredible resilience, but actually thrive in the aftermath of the traumatic event. Studies show that the majority of trauma survivors do not develop PTSD, and a large number even report growth from their experience. So he termed post traumatic growth, and he pretty much defined it as the positive psychological change that is experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So these 7 areas of growth have been reported to spring from adversity: greater appreciation of life, greater appreciation and strengthening of close relationships, increased compassion and altruism, the identification of new possibilities or a purpose in life, greater awareness and utilization of personal strengths, enhanced spiritual development, which definitely applies here, and creative growth, which definitely applies here. So my question for you, Solomon, is in terms of that definition, right? How have you, in your book, in your book and obviously in your kind of dialogues of Muda, how have you kind of witnessed Muda exemplify those characteristics of post-traumatic growth in the context of his struggles?
Well, that's a amazing question. I mean, his post-traumatic growth, I would say it would have undergone two main phases, right? So I don't know where this is in the literature of is it Dr. Kaufman or Mr. Kaufman?
You could say
Dr.
Dr.
Yeah, yeah,
Kaufman.
it's
Yeah, you
Dr.
said
Crawford.
Dr.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know where this is in literature, but basically, he explained to me a number of times that his way of dealing with the trauma was through alcohol. So it was substance abuse. That was the only way. He had so much pain that he had to numb it essentially, right? And the only way he could numb it was, through substance abuse. So I think that and violence. So what's an amazing story or theme without the book, which you'll see, is that when uh, Mutah has these traumatic moments in his life, the first thing he thinks about is violence. Like when his grandmother died, he was in the room with Gaddafi, and the first thing he does is he gets a gun, and he's like, if my no, sorry, not when his grandmother died. When he heard that his grandmother was on her deathbed, he said, if my grandmother dies, basically, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna hurt somebody. So that for me was amazing. That's his reaction. That was his reaction to trauma at the time. Not only that, once Pac died, him and Gaddafi went back to Irvington, and they just went back to the street life. They found solace in, violence, being on the streets, beating people up. So his first or immediate, I say, phase of post-traumatic dealings was turned into things that were destructive, right? And I don't know where that is in the literature. Um, but it basically that phase lasted too long for him, where he realized that if I uh, sustain this, I'm going to destroy myself. And when it got to that point where he realized I'm not, I can't go on like this, or else I'm going to die, or I'm going to kill somebody, one or the other. Um, then he really started to appreciate life, basically, and he really started to look for a purpose in life. And he didn't realize that it was going to be spirituality. He didn't realize that because he never grew. He had some of it with his grandmother. His grandmother's Christian, so they grew up with. I mean, he was born Muslim, but he grew up in a Christian household, and she was very adamant about making sure they had God in their life and things like that. But he wasn't really. That wasn't really what he was searching for until circumstances happened, and he met a guy named Mikhail Camille, and he sort of reintroduced him to Islamic spirituality, and then that ended up being phase two, where he found his purpose in spirituality. He found his purpose in, just trying to be a good person and trying to do positive things. And that transformation, that wasn't, it basically took him to the brink of death for him to get to that point, which is amazing. Yeah, amazing. And not just, I'm not talking about physical death. I'm also talking about just emotion. He said on so many times, like, he just went crazy. He's like, there's a 5-year period of his life he doesn't remember because of how much alcohol he consumed. He does not remember 5 years of his life because there wasn't a day of those 5 years where he wasn't, inebriated. Right. And I'm like, wow, that's just, but that's the reality. That's not just his reality. That's the reality of how many millions of people go through the same thing.
Right.
So,
and it's like, so when in Scott's book, he talked about kind of Abraham Maslow's experiences. And so this is, kind of for our audience, the person who is the founder of the hierarchy of needs. And so he kind of, the way he sort of termed it is that, well, not even just in terms of post-traumatic growth, but just kind of in terms of the way life goes, that eventually when you kind of, but it could obviously happen through trauma, right? But what happens is as a person kind of gets older, they realize all of these little things in life that initially seemed like they were sort of seemingly sort of irrelevant or just insignificant. The person kind of finds joy in them, right? So it's not like a peak experience where you're like on ecstasy or on cloud nine, but it's pretty much the idea that like I can find beauty in the ordinary. And so what happens a lot is, so this is not from Scott's literature, this is kind of from kind of my own work, is that when people experience trauma, and it seems like for Mu, it was like for him, he had to, rock bottom wasn't even necessarily the deaths of his parents or let's say even the death of his grandma. It was even beyond that. So sometimes what happens is when people feel like they've actually hit rock bottom, it's like, it's this black and white thing, right? Where they're on a seesaw, where once they finally hit rock bottom and they realize what it is to be in hell, for them, like the world as it was before actually appears like heaven. So they kind of go from like, oh my God, like this is like so tormenting and this is so horrible, right? That these things that I had before, like they were actually beautiful in contrast. And so sometimes when people kind of hit rock bottom, what they see is it's not that there's a heaven in the sense of like paradise on earth, right? It's not like I can create heaven in a way that's like, let's say, ethereal or kind of, let's say, kind of heavenly in the sense of like in the biblical sense, but it's like no, I can actually create heaven right in the ordinary, and let's say and kind of being a good person, right, and sort of even being a business owner, right, like starting a coffee shop, starting a barbecue business, being an important member of my community, being a spiritual guide or a spiritual leader, a therapist, a writer, a teacher, right? So sometimes what people find out is all of those things that may have at one time seemed like pretty boring were actually the things that make life more meaningful.
Exactly. Absolutely. And one of the things that one of the themes as he's making his transformation is that he begins to appreciate sobriety, because when he is trying to search for these answers, he realizes that if you're drunk all the time, you really can't think clearly. So you want to talk about simple things, he just appreciated the ability to think critically. That was one of the main things that Mikhail was able to help him come back to, is just the ability to think critically and think about life, think about what you're doing. Don't just react emotionally to things because that's going to lead you, down a path that you may not want it to be. So he began to just appreciate the ability to think as a rational human being, and that allowed him to also cut down, heavily on alcohol consumption, So this idea of being able to appreciate the simple things of life it's necessary when you have experienced basically, like you said, hell on earth. You experience every negative thing you could possibly imagine. You can find that you appreciate the simple things that are given to you,